One thing that I think is important is to distinguish content and force, right? So a lot of Williams' discussion of thick ethical concepts is based on the idea that they have thick descriptive content, right? That is entirely consistent with the interpretation-construction distinction. And then he points out that such concepts have force, so that by characterizing something as cruel, the force is condemnation. That if you say it's cruel, you're also condemning it. So force isn't the problem for the interpretation-construction distinction, because what we're interested in sort of is whether there's content there. And what I would like to suggest is that many of these evaluative concepts that we think of as thick ethical concepts, they're multi-criterial concepts with incommensurable dimensions. So cruelty, reasonable, and speedy, right? So whether it's speedy depends on more than one thing. It's not a vague concept. And, the way that the interpretation-construction distinction handles that is to say that for concepts like that, at least the way I handle it, is that the concept creates a construction zone, right? So, but on the other hand, suppose it doesn't, right? Suppose it doesn't. Suppose that the multi-criterial concept has baked into it a moral dimension of content that doesn't create a construction zone. Well, then, if that's the case, then the interpretation-construction distinction survives intact, right? But even there, though there may be epistemic difficulties, there might be intersubjective disagreement about what the moral content is. And that's it.
So I thought this discussion is very helpful for something. I worry about this distinction, and on alternate Tuesdays it seems persuasive, and then I sort of lose my grasp of it and no longer know what we're talking about. And this is my big problem with it, is that it seems to refer to a number of different things, each of which may be quite, there's some are more and some are less, but most of them fairly plausible within a certain domain. But the concepts, I never know quite what's going on. So just very, very quickly, I mean, one possibility is that the interpretation is just about what the words mean, and then what the legal effect is going to be, somebody else's job. So maybe we pay attention to the Constitution's words in one case, but they're overwhelmed by bad consequences or by changes or social changes or whatever. All of the rest of it about how seriously we take the words is construction. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that when you work really conscientiously to try to understand what a provision of the Constitution means, but the words and the history can only take you so far, and you're still left with either ambiguities or vaguenesses, or perhaps find out that it really has nothing to do with what we're now talking about. But in any event, originalism only goes so far, and so you just have to have other things to plug in when the history runs out and the text runs out. And then a third possibility is that the text and the history help us understand what the meaning of the Constitution is at some level, but that it is awfully difficult to translate that into something a judge can do. And so we need legal doctrine, and that the legal doctrine, at its best, legal doctrine comes as close as we can to achieving legal meaning in most cases, but the doctrine itself isn't necessarily derived from text or history. An example of this might be, the prohibition on content or viewpoint discrimination under the Free Speech Clause, and we might well think that doctrine gets as close as we can, but they didn't talk about that. It's not a historical or textual thing. And so I would just like to hear both Fred and Keith tell us more about, what are they talking about?
Steve? So in that vein, I'd be really interested in your sense of the definition or the bounds of what's linguistic. And in the, Will and I have an article, and I think Mike and John McGinnis disagree on certain points of, so what counts as part of the language? So for instance, I think their view is that the rule of lenity is sort of baked into part of legal language. And so in that world, there's not as much work for construction to do because interpretation is doing a lot. Whereas our view, I think, takes a narrower view of what's linguistic, sort of rules for how particular people use words, so either the author or the public or lawyers or whoever, those count as linguistic, but then there are lots of other norms that come in that are not necessarily linguistic in nature, and then so there's sort of more room on the other side. I don't know if that fully replaces the interpretation-construction distinction, but the reason why it would help is it seems like it might make some more sense of the examples. So for instance, we present the example in Law of Interpretation paper, just a private landowner tells the gatekeeper, don't let any vehicles into the park. No legal sort of notions here per se. And an ambulance, comes through and the gatekeeper lets it in, as everyone would think is the appropriate response. And if the owner came back and said, hey Joe, let any vehicles into the park today? Like the correct answer is not, no boss, see you tomorrow, and just sort of goes home. The correct answer is yes, but it was an ambulance and I thought that would be okay. And so it's clear that what's going on is not really the words being used, but rather other norms that govern sort of the practice of instruction giving and exceptions and all kinds of things like that. And if that's right, if there are all these other norms that come in, then maybe that explains some of the constitutive and evaluative terms that you were worried about, because it could just be like Tim Endicott's argument with reasonable, is once you've determined that the language means reasonable, you're done interpreting. And the question of which reasons might apply to you is a separate question about separate kinds of norms that linguistic norms are not going to answer. In which case, so I'd be very interested in your saying more on sort of what counts as linguistic, what isn't linguistic, and what does that distinction do for this one?
Okay, Fred, you got three. Okay, so I think there is a similarity among all three of these comments. Let me say a little bit about Larry's observations about moral content. In a way, they relate somewhat to what Steve was just saying about the extent to which, if there is legal language that points us to moral content, if there is legal language that points us to moral stuff of that variety, is that a function of the language or is it a function of something else? So Larry uses the term here and elsewhere and earlier construction zone. So one way of understanding, I think what I am trying to say is, for a large number of constitutional terms, the construction zone is so large as to be almost everything. If the construction zone is so large as to be almost everything, and therefore the interpretation zone gives us almost nothing, then it's not clear to me, at least for those terms, especially evaluative terms and maybe some constitutive ones, that the basic points behind the interpretation construction distinction is being served. Because after all, as its proponents argue, the real point of the distinction is to try to separate the legal stuff from the linguistic stuff. But if the linguistic stuff doesn't do anything other than point us to the full range of legal stuff, or maybe moral stuff as well, then we are still, broadly speaking, so much in the construction zone that although there might be a technical distinction out there, the construction zone so dominates, so dwarfs the interpretation as to make the very distinction not overly important. There's more to be said about that, but I'll keep it just at that. Now, Michael in a way, similarly says there is a distinction between how seriously we take the words. That's a little bit of what the colloquy between Keith and myself was about. That is, there are some instances in which we know what the words mean and we don't take them that seriously. That might be the 11th Amendment. It might be the Contract Clause. It might be the New York Statute of Wills and Riggs versus Palmer. In all of those cases, we have some pretty good idea of what the words mean, but we don't take it so seriously. That's different from the question, as Michael correctly puts it, with of those instances in which the words only take you so far and something else has to come in. And then the question is, what is that other stuff? Now, Michael, in talking about legal doctrine, uses this wonderful and suggestive and possibly ambiguous phrase, legal meaning. I think part of what we are talking about is the relationship between legal meaning and ordinary meaning, or the relationship between legal meaning and meaning full stop. Obviously, as with the content distinction in the First Amendment, a great deal of legal import is provided by the courts. Maybe all of the legal import is provided by the courts. Whether we want to call that legal meaning is a somewhat more difficult issue, and I think I want to resist calling it legal meaning and agree that it's legal doctrine. But whether legal doctrine is derived from legal meaning or is synonymous with legal meaning is to some extent exactly the point at issue. And I think what I want to say, and I suspect that some of the proponents of the interpretation construction distinction want to say, is we can call this legal doctrine. We can call this the product of construction, but let's not confuse it with the idea of meaning, which is a different idea. And finally, Steve described a very nice debate that he is on one side of. I'm on his side of this debate. That is, I think on this side of the debate, as you put it, the question is this part of the language or is it something else? For me, a great deal of legal construction, a great deal of the generation of legal results without duplicating either the words interpretation or construction, a great deal of the generation of legal results or generation of legal outcome does not come from the language. And insofar as it doesn't come from the language, it may come from lots of other things. But I want to stress that it doesn't come from the language, and it doesn't even come from the language if understood technically. It doesn't even come from the language if understood originally. It comes from somewhere else. And if at least part of the interpretation construction distinction is in some context to remind us of that, then I want to agree with it.
Okay. Keith, you want to say anything?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind just tacking on briefly that I think I'm with Michael about sort of part of what you're thinking about the interpretation construction distinction might be, and part, certainly a lot of what I tend to think of as emphasizing is these cases where the known meaning or discoverable meaning of the text runs out, and so you're trying to then say, what do we do under those circumstances? Either because, and that's true both in the context of when the text itself is vague or open textured enough, or the historical materials just aren't clear enough to give us enough guidance, but also where there are just gaps in the Constitution. So I think of what in the British context we might think of as constitutional conventions as also being instances of constitutional constructions which exist in the American context as well. So the tradition of a two-term presidency, for example, I think the unilateral removal power of the president of lower-level executive branch officials is a construction judicial review, I think, is arguably a construction in this sense of extensions of the Constitution, but they don't fall out naturally. And I would just like to put a pin in this point about the 11th Amendment. So I guess so it's interesting that you're framing of the 11th Amendment as an example of where we just don't take the words very seriously. And I guess my reaction to that is to think, well, if that's what you're doing it wrong. And so that either the 11th Amendment means what it says, and that's the whole rule, and we're done, in which case we ought to take the words very seriously and be limited to them, or you think the 11th Amendment is signaling that there was a background principle that the court had screwed up, and now what we're trying to do is go back to the background principle, and the 11th Amendment is just a signal of that, but the 11th Amendment doesn't encompass and capture all of that background principle. And yeah, I think there's reasonable arguments on both sides of that. But I don't think any of those arguments suggest that, well, the 11th Amendment says something, you shouldn't take it that seriously. That strikes me as the wrong way of doing it.
Okay. Bernie.
So thanks for this paper. It was really thought-provoking. I guess I have 2 points. One is a question about how much weight you're really putting on this idea of technical meaning, because it seems to me that most of your argument is kind of hinging on the nature of certain kinds of institutional practices as a backdrop for understanding particular constitutional provisions, which it seems to me doesn't necessarily have to be exclusive to technical or legal meaning, and that there seems to be a little bit of a kind of maybe conflation of two things or slippage between two things where you say, that the problem is created by legal technical language insofar as one of the basic points of the distinction between interpretation and construction is to distinguish between linguistic meaning and legal goals, and accordingly to ensure that the consideration of the law is distinguished from consideration of meaning, and that you're bringing law into the picture. To me, it feels like you're bringing legal practices into the picture, but not necessarily some of these other kind of legal norms that were being referred to in the earlier colloquy. So I'm not sure how much work really technical meaning or legal technical meaning is doing here. And then the other kind of question I had was just about you rely a lot on contract as a kind of basis for thinking about construction. But some of the examples sound more to me a little bit like equity or equitable interpretation of statutes, and especially when you're talking about kind of avoiding absurd results or in construction. And then that struck me as like, I wonder what you think about equity in that context.
Okay. Elon.
Thanks so much for the paper. Will this amplify my voice if I talk into that? No? Okay. Well, you will all have to amplify your ears instead. So I thought you were going to disagree with what I was about to say, but in your response to the last round of questions, maybe you'll agree with me. But what strikes me as problematic with the interpretation-construction distinction is that this is the work that construction is doing. We start with some legal rule A. Say the textual meaning of a statute is A, which creates legal rule A. And yet the outcome of the case is B, something else. And construction is whatever we do to get us from that legal rule A or textual meaning A to outcome B. When in fact, usually in a lot of these cases, something else entirely is happening, where we don't just have legal rule A. We actually have two legal rules out there. We have legal rule A, and we have legal rule B. And it's just a question of, they both seem to apply in this case, and someone has to decide which of those applies. So for the example in the Riggs v. Palmer case, 99 times out of 100, the New York Statute of Wills creates a clear a meaning that leads to legal rule A, and 99 times out of 100, you get A, outcome. But then in that case, you also had another legal rule already out there in the system that a wrongdoer shouldn't profit from his own wrong, and the court had to decide which of these two legal rules applies. As Marshall said in Marbury v. Madison, when there are two legal rules, we have to figure out what the operation of each is. I think the 11th Amendment's an example too. I don't think you need the 11th Amendment at all to decide Alden v. Maine or Hans v. Louisiana. Sovereign immunity was a legal rule that was just out there. And then we got the Constitution adopted on top of it. And what legal rules in the Constitution displace that sovereign immunity? Maybe necessary and proper clause, unless abrogating sovereign immunity is a great and substantive power. The point is there are two different legal rules, and the question is which one applies. And so my question is, isn't it true that when a judge does this analysis, figuring out the operation of these two existing legal rules. That's not interpretation, that's not construction. We need a different name entirely for it. Isn't it just a conflict of laws problem, so to speak? I don't know what we should call it, but it strikes me that a lot of those cases that we describe as construction is actually just this conflict of laws, trying to figure out the operation of two independently existing legal rules in the system.
Having learned that you're already on our side of the debate that Steve and I are part of, I'm not going to press you on it anymore. But instead, I'm curious about a different aspect of our legal practice, which is that it seems to me common for judges or others who engage in professional legal interpretation not to make these two steps clear, not to say the words of the Constitution mean X, and I'm now going to do Y. The words of the Constitution mean X, but that doesn't get me far enough, so I'm going to do Y. It's very much sort of hiding the interpretation construction distinction seems to be a crucial part of our judicial practice. And I guess I wonder, is that good or bad? Would it be better if judges were more explicit about it? And if you're unwilling to be normative, at least do you have a view about, is hiding it sort of better or worse for some interpretive methodologies or others? Do originalists have a special interest in surfacing this distinction so as to show that everybody else is making it up, or a special interest in hiding the distinction so as to conceal how little originalism answers? Question mark.
All right, you got three.
Okay, good. I think Bernie is right that much that I say about institutional stuff, institutional background, institutional presuppositions can apply to institutional considerations other than legal institutional considerations. I don't disagree with that at all. And we can imagine that there are lots of other terms that bring in, even outside the law and sometimes inside the law, a whole bunch of institutional considerations, but not legal institutional considerations. That I agree with. I want to talk a little bit more about equity. Equity is looming here and important here, as you suggest. It is interesting and relevant here that in the history of equity, the institutional separation of law and equity was much greater. That is, when you lost in the court of Henry whoever, when you lost in court at the time of Henry whoever, then you went to the chancellor. You went somewhere else. You crossed the street. You went down the block. You started a new proceeding. You did something that's quite different in ways that over time became first more crystallized and then became less crystallized as equitable considerations got blended into or absorbed into law. The high point or low point of that, depending on your point of view, for me comes not in a judicial opinion, but in a different kind of judicial act. So 30 years ago, plus or minus a few years, Guido Calabresi wrote a common law for the age of statutes, in which he essentially said that it is appropriate for courts to update obsolete statutes, in effect also saying it is appropriate for courts, regardless of the specificity of a statute, to do equity. The most important event surrounding that book is that Guido Calabresi then became a judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. In most countries in the world, anyone who wrote that book would be permanently disqualified from the judiciary, and the very fact that Calabresi was not disqualified says something about the absorption of equity into our understanding of what judges are supposed to do. And I think more needs to be said about that, more needs to be thought about that, but I think once we understand that that idea is pervasive, it does place a little bit of additional stress on the interpretation construction distinction. Now, I like the point about what we are frequently talking about is two laws. It's one of the reasons why I mentioned both Dworkin and Kennedy because Dworkin and Kennedy believe that in your sense, there are frequently, maybe even always, multiple legal possibilities to rationalize or justify or explain or support a legal outcome. And that very often, when a legal outcome is supported just by reference to one of those, it is partly the unspoken conclusion that the other one of them doesn't apply, but still the very fact of determining that the other one doesn't apply is still part of the full process. That's Kennedy's argument in legal formality. It's Dworkin's argument when he talks about the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, which is what the speed limit was when Dworkin wrote Law's Empire, that there is this kind of a conflicts problem out there. But if I can say a little bit more about Dworkin, Dworkin's better example for Dworkin's point is not Riggs versus Palmer. That is, in Riggs versus Palmer, there was indeed another legal rule out there. The New York Court of Appeals makes reference to the Code of Justinian and the Napoleonic Code and the law of Quebec and Rutherford's Institutes and some number of other things. All of the stuff that the majority relies on in Riggs was already somewhere in the law. Not so with Dworkin's other and better example, Henningsen versus Bloomfield Motors. That is, the New Jersey law at the time of Henningsen versus Bloomfield Motors was quite simply, you signed it, you're stuck with it. When the New Jersey Supreme Court said that has to give way to moral considerations of unconscionability and the like, they are bringing in moral stuff not previously recognized in a rule of recognition sense within the law. That may still be a conflicts problem, but that may be a conflicts problem between unrecognized moral considerations and legally recognized legal considerations. And once we recognize that that's going on with some frequency, then as with equity, once again, it may be hard to distinguish legal interpretation in the interpretation sense of the interpretation construction distinction from everything else. Now, Will presses me to be normative. Okay, I'll be normative. Hiding is bad. And that's not always bad. You have a child. I've never had children. At some point, whether the issue be Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny, or something of that sort, you're going to hide stuff. And there are certain contexts in which hiding is okay. But I wish we had normative statement. I wish we had more of the kinds of things, I think it was Blackmun, that Blackmun said about the contract clause. The contract clause says one thing. We haven't taken it seriously. I'm glad we haven't. That's good. I don't like the kind of hiding that, in effect, we see a lot of in constitutional adjudication, but we also see a lot of in Fuller's views about language. That is, Fuller wants to hide so much of legal stuff into meaning. At times, Fuller's a little bit more straightforward about it, but it confuses what's actually going on in much the same way that Fuller's enthusiasm or enthusiasm for legal fictions hides things. It would have been perfectly appropriate for Lord Mansfield to have said, there is a grave injustice being done on the island of Minorca, and we ought to do something about it, and we are going to do something about it, and if that departs from the letter of the law, so be it. Now, obviously, at the time that he wrote Mostyn versus Fabregas, everybody knew what he was doing. So I'm not sure in the classic legal fiction there's actually any hiding going on. He wasn't deceiving people into thinking that Minorca was in fact in London when it wasn't. So there is an interesting question in the classic legal fiction when there is transparent fictionalization. It's not hiding, but nor is it total honesty. What's actually going on is an interesting puzzle, and I don't have an answer to it.
All right, Ethan.
So I have my students read this Patterson piece when I introduce them to interpretation of contracts, and they have some difficulty distinguishing between interpretation and construction. And before Larry Solom came on the scene, I basically just told the students, just ignore it, it's not important, they're interchangeable. And I now no longer say that. But I think at least within contract, we've sort of improved on Patterson and improved on Lieber. And so, and in a way, this paper, you make your case too easy for yourself because you're stuck in sort of the Patterson-Lieber world where construction is about legal effect. And once you say that's what construction is, the hermeneutical circle is sort of obvious and your point is made for you, paper over. But I think, when you push forward to sort of the Williston-Corbin debates about interpretation and construction, you could at least make some distinction between the principles that are actually contributing to discerning the party's intent, right? So the specific controls the general, nocere associus, justum generis. These are all ideas that we use to approximate the party's intent. What we care about is the party's intent. And construction is just not that. We are going to construe against the drafter. We're going to avoid illegality. We're going to construe in the public interest. They are just different sets of tools of analysis. And now, Corbin had a critique of that, too, because he thought we were always sort of engaged in construction when we were doing interpretation. But I think that Williston tears them apart, and you have to do some work to show us that it's actually not possible to engage in the game of interpretation when you know what the goal is. So in the goal of contract is the party's intent, by and large. But we don't actually all agree on what the real goal is for the purpose of constitutional interpretation. I take it the Larry Soloms of the world and most people in this room are of the original public meaning form, and I take it that we have tools where we approximate what that is, and I take it these guys say when that runs out you can proceed to these other things. Now you really have to show us if the paper is to succeed the way, to use your language from a moment ago, the way the hiding is happening. How are they hiding through their corpus linguistic stuff or through the tools that they use, the construction material that are really kind of normative pushes on the text? And until you can show us that, then I think they can continue to sustain. Right? They would just say, I take it that original public meaning just is meaning in its legal context. So they're not susceptible to the hermeneutical circle that you've pointed out.
I'm next on the queue, and I thought Steve Sachs was actually going to make my point, but I think Steve and Will have a slightly different take on these things. So I found myself writing in the margins of the paper something about the pragmatics of language, that when we talk about the linguistic meaning, we can have a thin view, like just looking at dictionary meanings or things of that sort, or we could have a sense of the linguistic meaning in the context in which it's uttered. And in the context in which it's uttered, we have these pragmatics that we use to interpret what people are telling us or are asking of us or are demanding of us. And so a lot of the examples, and I could do the same. I found myself doing the same riff on almost every example in there, but I could do it on Hans or Riggs. But I'm going to use the nice case you haven't mentioned yet, which is in your footnote, but it's a nice case, United States versus Kirby, which, if I recall, where it was a postman who delivering the U.S. mails who was arrested for murder, right, and by a sheriff, and the question was whether he's in violation of the U.S. code for interfering with the delivery of the mail, right? And so now the question of whether, I mean, the U.S. code, seemed in a literal conventional meanings, linguistic sense, to apply. The sheriff who arrested Kirby for murder was indeed interfering with the delivery of the U.S. mail. But one would say, and I think you could say this in Fuller's kinds of examples as well, that of course it didn't mean that, right? It just that there are implicatures here, which is that we often say we often assert less than we say and often more than we say, and here's a case where the U.S. code was asserting less than it seems to say. And it seems to me a lot of the examples are like that. Hans versus Louisiana could be read that way. So, given the pragmatics of the background about sovereign immunity, and then you just don't read it in a sort of non-contextual way. You don't read the 11th Amendment as inconsistent with the result in Hans. Same thing's true with Riggs. You could so when the gatekeeper lets the ambulance onto the grounds, was he defying the owner's wishes? Well, so one way that Steve described it is, well, yes, I did let a vehicle in, but of course that would have been all right with you. Another way of looking at it, though, is to say, of course you didn't mean to exclude ambulances. And that would be, and I think that would be the way, so that linguistic meaning is quite rich in its context, and therefore leaves less room for other things to intrude. I mean, a lot of what Fuller does can be just thought of as looking at the pragmatics of language use, rather than saying there's something, we're adding something on to the language. And then Chris.
Larry said the word pragmatics, which is taking maybe 20% of my thunder. So I'm wondering if the distinction between interpretation and construction is really the same as the distinction between semantics and pragmatics. And it's similarly fraught, similarly difficult to classify sometimes which side of the line we're in. So one way to think of it is no vehicles in the park is the same kind of problem as no beer in the fridge. So there's this example, you open the fridge, you say, there is no beer. And linguists and philosophers say, well, this is quantifier domain restriction. You don't mean there's no beer, you mean there's no beer, brackets, in the fridge. So you have so the semantic interpretation of that phenomenon would be to say, well, you have this tacit restriction that's in the meaning of the term in the context. But then the pragmatic thing is, oh, no, you're saying something false. But everybody understands it's okay to say something false. So on the pragmatic interpretation of that phenomenon, people are just all the time saying stuff that's false. So I was, just having a dispute on Twitter with Sam Rickless yesterday, and I was saying, no, it's got to be a semantic phenomenon if people are going to be saying true things most of the time. Fuller, similarly, he's got this instance of a tank that's going to be allowed in the park, despite this statute. He wants that to be compliance with the statute. And to say, oh, no, it's disobeying the statute, but sometimes it's okay to disobey statutes. Sometimes it's okay to disobey the meaning. That just causes a lot more tension in the world, it's a simpler, more economical interpretation to say, no. It's a tacit restriction on what vehicle refers to. So Larry suggested about the ambulance just now, and Fuller's suggestion really about the same thing. I think you get more law compliance. You're interpreting the world to have more law compliance. Similarly to interpreting quantified domain restriction to be semantic, you're getting more true statements. And that's just something, as a general matter of charity and interpretation, we should want, I think.
So, all three of you have relied heavily, more heavily than I generally prefer, on context. I occasionally worry that too many sins have been committed in the name of context, since much of the issue is how broad or how narrow a context, and what do we want to include in the context. So Ethan says, appropriately, meaning in its legal context, if I think I quoted you right. But then the question is, what is the legal context? If the legal context includes, to go back to Bernie's comment, if the legal context includes equity, if the legal context includes the avoidance of absurd results, if the legal context includes the avoidance of obsolete results, Calabrese, if all of that is part of the 2019 American legal context, then I'm not sure how much work meaning by itself is actually doing. Much the same could be said in response to Larry. Larry talks about attributed intent, linguistic meaning in context, context in which it is uttered, and so on. I'm not sure I want to entirely put it in terms of the distinction between semantics and pragmatics, as Chris put it, but that's close. That is, I think there are some of us, possibly mistakenly, who want to distinguish the idea of what is it that these words mean in at least a partly acontextual way. To come back to Bentham, I have Benthamite sympathies. Maybe I shouldn't, but I have Benthamite sympathies in the sense that one function of law is to speak to primary actors. It might be that the primary actors are contracting parties in making a contract. It may be that primary actors are police officers who read from a Supreme Court opinion whenever they are giving a Miranda warning. If one function of law is to speak to primary actors without the intervention of lawyers and judges and a whole bunch of other stuff, then there is at least some role to be played by acontextual meaning, linguistic conventions, call it what you want, semantics or something. If there is some role to be played by acontextual meaning, even if it doesn't always get it exactly right, then, and here I am more defending than attacking the interpretation construction distinction. The interpretation construction distinction reminds us that there is something out there that is at least quasi-acontextual linguistic content, linguistic meaning, and at least for me, that has some role to play in law. Whether it does or should have a role to play in contracts, I will leave to the contract theorists. I know a little bit, but only a tiny little bit, about the debates between objective and subjective theories of contractual interpretation. But I think I want to sympathize with the interpretation construction distinction insofar as it argues against the Fullers of the world that we don't want to build in the full idea of a good legal result into the meaning of legal language.
All right. We have 4 people remaining on a queue. We have 3 minutes. So if, all right, well, Richard Primus, you get the
one.
the one, yeah.
I'll be brief. I want to pick up on something that Ethan said that I think is useful here. I think falls out of what Ethan said, but it went by quickly, which is the suggestion that it may be part of what makes trouble for the interpretation, construction, distinction in modern originalism is its move from intent through understanding the public meaning. Right? That is to say, when originalism was more about intent, interpretation, construction was easier. Right? It gets harder when you're trying to do public meaning because you're precisely for reasons that fall out of Ethan's about not looking for intent anymore and trying to make sense of text, which lends itself better to construction. But what I want to ask you, Fred, is this. Imagine your palette of different colored highlighted markers. And imagine you have to go through the Constitution and mark in one color all the constitutive terms, and in another color all the evaluative terms. And you can have a third color for everything else that does work, right? Your picture gives us a very different sense of the enterprise of constitutional decision-making, depending on the proportions that we see of those three colors, right? And as I just think to myself briefly about clauses in the Constitution, I think those first two colors are going to cover a lot of ground. And I think even more so if you limit yourself to the parts of the Constitution where a constitutional adjudication is actually contested in all the cases that we worry about. And if that's right, then your suggestion, produces a very different picture of what's going on in constitutional interpretation than there might seem to be if we thought that what you were giving us was exceptional ways of approaching those sorts of things as apart from the text that governs us generally.
Yeah, I agree. So that is, I agree. I mean, there's no time to talk at great length or even at no length about the selection effect, but I agree that most of what we worry about in litigated or adjudicated constitutional issues is, as you put it, the first two colors. And one way of summarizing at least the part of what I'm saying that's a challenge to the interpretation, construction, distinction, is that if most of litigated constitutional law, most of contested constitutional law is about the constitutive or evaluative terms, the distinction between interpretation and construction, however useful it might be for ordinary statutes primarily directed to ordinary people, doesn't help us very much in constitutional adjudication. So I'll stop at that with one final thing. If you haven't read the paper carefully, please read footnote 24, not for anything that I have said, but the quoted sentence in footnote 24 ought not to be lost to history. So thank you.
Let's thank Fred and Keith for.
Thank you.